Okay, thank you. I just really want to kind of first start off by, recognizing the organizers here because I think a lot of these talks are really all dovetailing really well. I was kind of struggling with just how much information I could pack into this presentation within this short time frame, and trying to figure out what should I include and what can I take out. And really hearing these other presenters talking about the QAPs and your project planning really kind of will help boost my presentation. So great job to the organizers. My name is Jacob Oaxaca. As mentioned, I'm the supervisor for the Program Development, Research, and Enforcement Unit here with California ELAP, or the accreditation program. Before I get started, can I get a feel of the room here? How many people have worked with a laboratory already, or through any of your projects or prior past experience? Okay, got a good number here. Okay, and have they been ELAP accredited laboratories for the most part, or okay, got a mix here. Does anybody want to maybe kind of give an observation on if you've noticed a difference between working with an accredited laboratory and a non-accredited laboratory? If you want to shout the answer, and then I can repeat it for those who are hearing online. Anybody want to provide? No? Well, in that case, okay, so I'll kind of just start off with the presentation then. Since I'm with the accreditation program, I'm going to go ahead and start this presentation with the value of accreditation. I'm going to provide a little bit of clarification about some misconceptions about accreditation. Then I'll provide a perspective on a number of areas that you'll want to consider when selecting a laboratory. And this with the idea of being able to support the data quality needs of your project. Lastly, I'll kind of finish up with some pointers on ideas on what to expect and how to communicate and work with your selected laboratory. This, as I mentioned, being from ELAP, this is going to be the perspective of the accreditation program. In a lot of ways, this could have probably been given by a laboratory who has the experience working with the citizen monitoring groups. But just again, this is kind of the perspective of accreditation and working with laboratories from the accrediting body. So in simple terms, accreditation is a tool that for laboratories to show that they're capable of producing accurate and defensible data. It will demonstrate that the laboratories are committed to continuous improvement. And lastly, when the accreditation program is effective and there's an effective standard, this can really enhance the public confidence in these test results. So I do want to, as I mentioned, I do want to clarify a few misconceptions about accreditation. First one is that accreditation does not mean that any report or set of data that is originating from an accredited laboratory is accurate or defensible. Again, I mentioned that through accreditation, we can demonstrate that the laboratory is capable of producing accurate and defensible data. When we went in to assess that laboratory, when we assessed their application, we had determined that they are capable of doing it, but we're not there the other 363 days out of the year. So, and I think a lot of this stems from the terms accreditation and certification. That creates a lot of confusion. And so whenever I hear I'm having a discussion with somebody and I hear somebody say ELAP certification, I really try and take a pause and kind of make a point of clarifying that ELAP accredits the laboratories. We're not certifying laboratories. And that's because with certification, to me, it implies that ELAP has certified the data that is coming out of these laboratories, and that's not the case. We are not certifiers of this test data. So what accreditation means is that, and I already kind of hit this though, is that the laboratory is capable of producing that data. So as the data users, you are responsible for always evaluating the data that you receive from these laboratories, and you're going to evaluate it against your data quality objectives, your QAP. What are you trying to answer? You know, all of those things that you heard from the last two presenters. And that's going to really help you to, if you've defined those, if you know what those are, that's really going to help you to make a determination on the usability of this data before you submit it or even use it for your intended needs. Another misconception is that if a laboratory is accredited by ELAP, then they can perform any test, and they're accredited for all tests, and that again is incorrect. The laboratories will receive a scope of accreditation that identifies the analytes and the test methods that are the laboratory was accredited to perform. So just again, if the laboratory is ELAP accredited, they have to be accredited for the specific analyte and the methods that you're looking for in your testing objectives. And just the last point on accreditation I want to make is that it's not forever. The period of accreditation for when it comes to ELAP accreditation is 2 years, and the laboratory must reapply every 2 years. And during that period, they may have some operational changes at their laboratory that result in changes to their scope of accreditation. So it's very important to be looking at that, especially if you're contracting with a laboratory right around that period where their accreditation is about to expire. You'll want to make sure that you're checking in with the laboratory to make sure that it did get extended. And from the accreditation program's perspective, we have up until the last day of that certificate to renew that accreditation. And so give the laboratories a little bit of breathing room because they're probably waiting to hear back from us. But it is important to just be aware that the accreditation can expire and their scope can change. Here's where, really the last two presentations are really going to help because, we don't have to get too much into a lot of this, but the careful selection of laboratories and the analytical methods is going to be critical to the success of your project. And so beforehand, before you're even selecting a laboratory, your project planning phase, you want to be you're asking these types of questions. And again, you heard these in the other presentations. So what are you testing? Whatever it is, if it's a drinking water sample, if it's non-potable water, if it's going to be soil sludge, or even some other matrix that is just unique and particular to your testing project, you want to have that identified up front and be aware of what that is, because that's going to drive what are your objectives. It's going to drive, what analytical method you select. We talked about target analytes. What are you, what's the intent? What's the goal of your testing? And I think when I kind of came in, Eric was a little bit into it, but he talked about the progression of the different types of monitoring you might be doing. If it's just for informational purposes, that's going to change what laboratory you end up selecting. But you may have some remediation goals, or you may be trying to demonstrate that this sample you collected can meet some permit limits. So all of that is really appropriate to identify up beforehand, because this is really a critical decision point for the success of your project. Because if you select an inappropriate laboratory or even an inappropriate analytical method, then you may end up having to repeat your entire study, which could derail your project or even increase the costs. We talked a little bit about analytical methods, and I'll kind of pause here and kind of make a few more points. There's validated methods. These are methods that are developed by, for example, EPA standard methods, and these are really kind of, as you go through your project planning, you're going to you'll either identify that there's these methods that are already validated and ready that are going to be able to meet your needs. But in some cases, this particular method may not be able to go low enough to the limit, or reach low enough limits to support your decision making or meet your specific project needs. So when that happens, you may have to look for a method that is a non-standard method, and a lot of times that can be a lab developed method. And if you end up going that route, if your path takes you into that direction, then you just need to be aware of what are the implications of a non-standard method? Is there a way to validate it? Is there a way to make sure that data that is going to be generated and produced using this non-standard method, will it be acceptable for use as the life of your project goes on? Okay, so now you kind of have, or maybe even you have a sense of what your testing objectives are. So the next step is going to be to locate and hire an environmental laboratory. And really this information here is presented as a starting point. So, location, right? I mean, that's going to be one of the main questions you're going to want to figure out regarding your laboratory. Is the location convenient? And it's really critical because in some cases there may be short hold times, and so you may need to get the sample to the laboratory immediately or within 2 to 6 hours, something of that time frame. So the location is going to be really critical, and you kind of have to think about that as part of your planning and in selecting a laboratory. It will also kind of determine how you're going to be transferring the samples. If you're selecting a laboratory that's maybe in another part of the state, you'll have to think about logistics. Are you going to, a lot of times a laboratory may have a courier service as part of the services they offer, but in most cases you'll have to FedEx or do some other kind of shipping like that. And depending on what your samples are, you may have some limitations on what the courier or FedEx will accept. So these are all things that you want to be considering. If it's a local laboratory, you may have somebody on your team dropping off the samples, or depending on your discussions with the laboratory, they may have somebody who will come by and take the samples for you or even pick them up. So these are just kind of, again, our starting points for what to consider when selecting a laboratory. And then last one, a lot of times you may not be thinking about this, but you're working on a Friday afternoon, and all of a sudden, you realize, oh, is the laboratory going to be open tomorrow when you need to drop off your samples? And so it's very important to consider that your project planning and the schedule, because if you need to be able to drop off samples on a weekend, then you want to have that knowledge ahead of time so that you're able to work that out with the laboratory. We talked about accreditation a lot. You want to know what the current status of the laboratory's accreditation is going to be. If it's close to that time where it's coming up against the renewal point, you want to make a note to be sure to follow up with them after that time. Does the laboratory have a written quality assurance plan? I mean, they, just like you guys are working on one, the laboratories should have one for themselves as well. And you'll want to review that. Most laboratories usually will have something that's very, there's similar elements, but they could vary considerably. So you'll want to make sure that you have reviewed that and make sure that it's going to be aligned with what your project needs are. In some cases, you may be doing some non-routine sampling where the laboratory may need staff that requires additional training or qualifications to perform the analysis. And so that's going to be something you want to check in with them. Lastly, what support services do you need or does the laboratory provide? And most importantly, is that going to be included in the cost? So providing coolers for shipping, chain of custodies, pre-cleaned or certified sample bottles. Any one of these additional services may be helpful to your project. ELAP has to remain impartial, and we can't really recommend a laboratory. But what we have is, as a resource, is a GIS map here, and the link is right here, so you can come back and use it at your convenience. But what it does is it gives you an idea of where laboratories are located, and there's a little bit of search functions in there to kind of narrow down what specific testing needs you may have. And so, again, this is kind of just a resource for helping you identify where laboratories are and which ones you're able to use. So now that you've selected your laboratory, you're going to want to consider, again, the customer support. Do you have somebody who's going to be a dedicated project manager, giving you the time and that you need, and again, for the money that you're paying? You'll want to be able to receive timely review and notification from sample receipt to sample analysis to when the results are ready. A big one is cost of QC. A lot of times, a laboratory may, either depending on the size of your project, they may include that, as a built-in price, or it may end up being charged separately. And data package options are really important because Melissa talked about it. The level of data that you get back, depending on what the data is going to be used for, you may need that big set, the level 4. In other words, it's all the raw data. It's all of the documentation that's needed to demonstrate the reliability and validity of those analytical results. And lastly, with any kind of contract you enter into, you're going to want to be aware of the lab's standard terms and conditions. Project discussion. Once you kind of get in contact with the laboratory and you're getting ready to contract with them, you want to make sure that all the testing requirements are adequately defined and documented. You want to have that discussion about whether or not the data needs to be updated to a state or a program database, because that could result in additional costs. And any differences that you have during these project discussions should either be documented and resolved before you start submitting the samples. When you drop off the samples, you want to make sure that your chain of custody is properly documented. You'll want to get some type of sample receipt confirmation. And after the laboratory receives those samples, they're going to check the chain of custody versus what the sample bottles you provided. And sometimes you may have a mislabeled bottle, maybe one of the bottles cracked during shipping. And so any of those kind of discrepancies, you're going to want to make sure that you're notified, because again, that could impact your overall project. You'll want to be aware of turnaround times. A lot of times the laboratories go through what is called a rush, or where you can get results within 24 hours or 5 days. The normal turnaround time is 15 days. And just be aware that with these rush samples, you may get some preliminary results, or even, and you may not get the final result until the end. And then once you get those results, a lot of, with the advances in our technology and everything, and not wanting to print everything, especially these level 4 data packages, which could be hundreds and hundreds of pages, laboratories may now only be providing electronic results. So you'll want to know whether that's something you need or not. Data qualifiers, you can probably expect that some part of your data may have been outside of a QC limit, and these data qualifiers will allow you to evaluate your data and whether or not that exceedance, or if it goes outside of the quality control criteria, how that's going to impact your data. And along those lines, you'll want to have a conversation with the laboratories about Do they provide a data review or interpretation? Because you may or may not, you may need that, some of that assistance. So, and that could come in the form of a case narrative. They may provide additional information, such as a graph or something of that nature. So again, I try to pack a lot in there, and hopefully it was beneficial for you. And I'll take some questions if there's about 1 minute. Okay. All right. Okay.
We have time for questions. Mike's been unmuted. We can take a question in the room.
Is it easy to find a list of accredited labs per analyte, per thing that you're sampling?
Not from the ELAP, for an ELAP accredited laboratory.
Okay.
We recognize that that's a need and that's something that can be beneficial to the public. So we're working on providing something like that. But at this point, we have that GIS map, and you can search. There's got some search functions where you can get down to maybe some higher level, maybe not particularly the analyte, but
right, not down to that level of
maybe not down that
resolution.
Level, but, a higher level, what we call fields of testing.
Okay, thanks.
The mic's coming.
I'm sure I can, well, I don't know how accessible the ArcGIS map actually is, but especially considering cost and community access, I'm wondering if there are partnerships or accreditations with community colleges. If not community colleges, then other universities, like the public universities, to be able to make this affordable and accessible to the most communities that otherwise are not going to be able to afford a lab. And or are there lab partnerships where they donate these services?
So you're talking about the GIS map or just in general lab services?
Accessibility to the labs.
Okay. ELAP is a voluntary accreditation program, so a laboratory would make that decision whether or not they want to participate and receive that accreditation. So ultimately, it's a decision for the laboratory to be able to participate. So there are universities that are ELAP accredited, but there's a bar and a criteria that needs to be met to receive accreditation. And so that's really the driver there in terms of, which labs are available for the community.
I have a question for you to follow up on that. For the science that we're typically doing, must we use an ELAP laboratory?
So thank you for that question. ELAP data that is going to be used for regulatory purposes, for example, compliance with a permit, policy, or order, does need to come from an ELAP accredited laboratory. In that spectrum of projects that you discussed, some of those, the projects on the beginning end, where you're just looking for information, you're talking about pH and things of that nature. If those don't, if it's not going to be used for regulatory compliance or purposes, then the decision is up to you whether or not you want to use an accredited laboratory.
And to follow up on your question, for the laboratories at the community colleges and whatnot, as long as they're using a quality assurance project plan, can document the quality, they're using standard EPA methodology and whatnot, their data is good. It's usable, it's actionable without having the ELAP certification. And we've been working throughout the state to do that. But there is a need sometimes that we have to go to an accredited laboratory because of the method. And not all laboratories can provide the same services for methodology. So you do have to shop around. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, real fast. Once you've accredited a lab for ELAP, how frequently do you go back and inspect that lab to ensure that they're compliant with their own QAPP?
The law requires every 2 years.